All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And we are doing something special this week. We are calling it Partisans Week. That is because our esteemed co-host Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt has a new book out. It is called Partisans. Round of applause. Yay, bravo. And look, we're making a new rule here. If you're a co-host of this show and you write a book, you get a week. Okay? So it is. So Kelly, you're on notice.
I can't wait.
It is Partisans Week. Here to kick it off, as always, the author of the new book, Partisans, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt. Hello, Nikki, and congratulations.
Thank you, Jody, and hello.
And with us, of course, as always, Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hey there, and congrats. Happy book day. Thank you.
Yeah. It is coming out right now. We were just chatting about how the audiobook is out, and mine's in the mail. Kelly's already arrived. But yes, people are diving in. There was a great New York Times review. So we're all very excited about this. And I'm just going to lay this out, but then, Nikki, we're in your hands for this. But basically what we're going to do here is kind of do what a number of other podcasts actually do, which is this thing where one host knows everything and the other host is kind of going in a little blind. And so obviously, Nikki, you know about this topic and you're going to choose the topics and you're going to walk Kelly and I through this. We don't really know what we're going to discuss, but we'll just react and try and, pick your brain a little bit. I will say, by the way, that a lot of podcasts, this is kind of the format, and I don't like that. I feel like if you host the show, you should know what you're talking about. But nevertheless.
It's so funny, Jody, because when you recommended this, I was like, I think Jody hates
this. But as an exception for this one, since we have an Uber expert on one hand, we can kind of diminish the expertise on the other hand. And I suspect we will have things to say.
I can pull some of my 20th century grad school prep into the conversation.
Well, you also cheated. You listened to a little bit of the book yesterday.
I did. I listened to about the first 90 minutes while I was organizing my pantry. And so I know it shouldn't take me that long to organize a pantry, but it did. And it was enjoyable because I was listening to Partisans. So I'm excited to dive in.
So, Nikki, before you tell us kind of which, and we're going to do 3 of these, before you tell us which story you're going to walk us through first, what's the book about?
So the book is about the conservative revolutionaries of the 1990s, this new strain of conservatism that emerges after Reagan leaves office, after the Cold War ends, when you have not only this new media environment, but just a very different set of assumptions for how politics should work. I mean, for conservatives, the Cold War had been the organizing principle of the movement for 40 years, and all of a sudden it was gone. And that gave space for people like Pat Buchanan and Rush Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich and Dinesh D'Souza and Laura Ingraham and all of these people to forge a new kind of conservatism that was more pessimistic, more resentment-focused, more media-savvy, and that looks a lot more like the conservatism we have today.
Yeah. All right. So we've touched on this a little bit in our show, and you've certainly brought some of that research as you've been doing it to topics. But what you got for us? Let's do it.
All right. What I have is on A Day in February 1995, Helen Chenoweth, who is a representative from Idaho, she'd just been sworn in for her first term, appeared at a hearing for the House Subcommittee on Resource Conservation. obviously very famous, very important committee. And at the hearing, she quizzed the Undersecretary of Agriculture for Natural Resources and Environment about black helicopters. Now, Kelly, your husband is an aviator. What do you know about black helicopters?
Helicopters? Nothing. The paint, you mean? It's like a black helicopter?
Yes. It's not a racist thing.
I don't know. Clearly, I'm missing something.
Jody?
I think I have a sense of this conspiracy theory that the government is sending secret helicopters to, I don't know exactly what. I'm going to guess, just sort of with my basic knowledge of the era, that it's either related to land rights or the IRS, or maybe some combination of the two.
I mean, yes, and you're very, very close. It is, these black helicopters were a symbol of conspiracies about the federal government, like the Bureau of Land Management, the IRS, but also one world government, that these were secretly UN helicopters, and they were surveilling the freedom-loving patriots of places like Idaho in order to track their movements and to ultimately take over their land.
Oh, wow. That's a lot.
So this is a person in Congress who is spreading these conspiracy theories, and she warns the undersecretary that she would become his worst nightmare unless these helicopters were grounded. And he was like, what helicopters? We don't have black helicopters. We sometimes use regular helicopters to kind of get around, but we don't have them. And so they're like, what's your proof? And she was like, well, I haven't personally seen them. But as she tells the committee, enough people in my district have become concerned that I can't just ignore it.
Who is peddling this? That's what I want to know. Who is like, I spotted one. It's a black helicopter. It's a stealth helicopter or whatever. Like, who is peddling that controversy or that rumor?
So, she had just said enough people in my district have become concerned. So who are the people in her district in Idaho? She represents Idaho's 1st District, which stretches up from the southern border of Idaho all the way up to the Canadian border. And it includes a spot on the map called Ruby Ridge. What do you guys know about Ruby Ridge?
Oh, yeah. There was a big standoff there. I know this. It's on our list.
I don't know anything about
episodes
Ruby
to
Ridge.
do, but walk us through Ruby Ridge.
Ruby Ridge is just a natural feature in the very remote wilderness of northern Idaho. And it is the place where a man named Randy Weaver, his wife Vicky, and his family located off the grid when they were on the run from the FBI and U.S. Marshals. Weaver was involved in the militia movement and attached to various white power groups. And he'd actually been set up by the FBI in an entrapment scheme for selling guns. And so he had a warrant out for his arrest. And so he goes off the grid to this cabin. And over the course of time, U.S. Marshals start to stake out the area. They surround the cabin, and there's a standoff. And in the standoff, Vicky Weaver is killed. Their dog is killed. A U.S. Marshal is killed, and it becomes this place where all of these militia members, all of these white power activists come, and it eventually becomes kind of a shrine or a place of martyrdom that looms so large along with Waco in the militia movement of the 1990s. And it's one of the things that turns the militia movement into this mass movement in the 1990s, and it becomes part of the core constituency of Helen Chenoweth in Congress.
So Chenoweth's testimony is after Ruby Ridge had gone down.
It's after Ruby Ridge, yeah.
And I mean, Ruby Ridge got a fair amount of press, I would say, right? And I mean, I think you're describing how it became a moment of martyrdom. But, was there any reporting in the aftermath of Ruby Ridge that there were actually black helicopters? How does that come out of a moment that did get a fair amount of attention as opposed to something that was completely lurking in the shadows and then bubbled up?
Yeah, so no black helicopters at Ruby Ridge, but the black helicopter had come to stand in for all of these conspiracies about federal power. Yeah. And it was federal power and federal agencies that were at the heart of the militia movement's opposition, the war that it was carrying out with the federal government. And Chenoweth believes in things like, you've probably heard of the constitutional sheriff's movement Is that on your radar at all? It's this idea that sheriffs are the primary law enforcement, the highest law enforcement unit in the country. So if a federal agent wants to come to Idaho, he has to get permission from the local sheriff in order to carry a gun or whatever. That's not how things actually work.
I was going to say.
But that's the idea.
This is crazy to me.
Yeah.
This is crazy to me because I remember, I've lived a lot of places. I used to live in Spokane, Washington, not far, maybe 40 minutes from the Idaho border. And Idaho was wildin'. Like this is like, early 2000s where people talked about like, it's not safe to go as a black person to go in Idaho, especially northern Idaho. There's a lot of white supremacists. They marched every year, like for decades until the head of the Klan died. They would, march in the thousands down Coeur d'Alene or wherever. And it just was always so bizarre to me to see Idaho as this stronghold of white nationalism. I think you expect that in other places, but Idaho has an interesting history, to say the least.
And not just history. I mean, it's still that that Pacific Northwest white nationalist strain is still there. There were big KKK protests just this year in Coeur d'Alene.
Yeah.
In Coeur d'Alene, yeah. And Kelly, you know this history from the 19th century where places, in 18th and 19th century, where places like Oregon were set up with explicit, like, only white people laws. And so, and that strain runs through Chenoweth's career as well. She, when they're talking about diversifying the Bureau of Land Management and the forest rangers, she's like, if people from warmer climates wanted to come to this area, they would have come. You can't force people from warmer climates to come up here, which, of course, she's talking about particularly Black and Latino people. And, environmentalism, anti-environmentalism was a huge part of her politics. It's so big out west, especially in the 1990s. And she would do things like hold endangered salmon bakes in order to make fun of it.
That's insane.
But she would come up with all sorts of conspiracy theories about environmentalists, but she also said, and I think that ties it all together, the real endangered species is the Anglo-Saxon male.
Wow. I can't.
Yeah.
But that idea that those like racist politics and some of these like broader things that you don't think have that much to do with race, like Western environmentalism, they come together in a figure like Chenoweth.
Well, it's like, end times apocalyptic thinking, and that this is a truly existential fight.
That becomes even more acute in our moment right now. Like in the 90s, I think we could have laughed off a lot of these people or said, this is absurd. But now, I mean, there's so much more credence to people who take up those ideas that it's no longer a laughing matter. It's in fact, it's quite serious.
Yeah, people made fun of Chenoweth because she did say all kinds of ridiculous things. She would be like, how could salmon be endangered if I can buy a can at Albertsons? And you're like, there are many different kinds of salmon.
Yeah. At least she referred to Albertsons, which is a Pacific Northwest chain. Unlike Dr. Oz, who doesn't even know the regional supermarket chains, she at least got that part right.
She was legitimate. Yeah. There also was a moment, of course, Kelly, that brought the dangers home, and that was the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which was carried out by people with ties to militias and white power groups. And Chenoweth, in the aftermath of Oklahoma City, she doesn't excuse the bombing, but she's like, these people have legitimate grievances, and if you, the federal government, would have addressed their concerns about Black helicopters and other issues, then maybe something like this wouldn't have happened.
So I want to hold that thought about the run up to Oklahoma City and ask you a question about that, but specifically on the Chenoweth testimony. I mean, skepticism about government power, concerns about environmental or private land encroachment, like all of these are reasonable things for a representative from that part of the country to, advocate for and be aware of. Is there something about the fact that it's couched in this conspiracy theory and that is making its way all the way to a hearing in Congress that feels particular to something about the 90s?
Absolutely. It's the thinning of the boundaries between extremism and formal politics that's happening on the right in this moment. Because, for instance, Chenoweth holds, it's her very first meeting with her constituents when she goes back to Idaho for the first time after being elected. She holds a hearing or a meeting about excessive use of government force. You can look around and give me like excessive use of government force. It seems to be a big problem. It ties into issues around policing and things like that. But the star person there is Randy Weaver's lawyer. And so there's no effort to draw a line or to demarcate or to suggest that there's something wrong with these violent militias and these white power groups. It's more a wholesale embrace of them. And that, I think, is the difference and why something that has real credibility, which is the government really screwed up at both Ruby Ridge and Waco. They made some real mistakes. They used too much force. But that there was no delineation between the problem and this set of people who were making war on the federal government is a real problem.
Yeah. We should wrap up because we have two more of these, and this is really fascinating. People, I'm sure, can read more about this in your book. But you mentioned the sort of Oklahoma City bombing and how you can see this pattern and this rise of violence and conspiracy thinking and so forth that then culminates in a real act of horrific and mass casualty violence. I know you've been out there talking in the days, the weeks since the FBI went into Mar-a-Lago, and there's been a lot of reporting on the kind of like ramping up, if that was even possible, but the ramping up of violent language. Does it feel like that? Does it feel like the run-up to Oklahoma City right now?
It feels eerily familiar in some ways. In 1995, G. Gordon Liddy, who was a conservative radio talk show host, was telling his listeners to aim for the heads of federal agents because they have body armor on. And you had the NRA coming out with fundraising letters that talked about federal agents as jackbooted thugs. And today you have a former president saying that federal agencies are the Gestapo. And that kind of language invites a level of violence that we became familiar with in the 1990s, and that I certainly am not alone in being pretty concerned about the use of that language today.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know how you work your way to a close from that, other than to say that's the end of the episode.
And it's important to understand the 1990s to understand.
Yes, to know.
That'll be the button.
Right. So first episode of Partisans Week is done. You can go buy the book now in the time between when this episode comes out and the next one comes out. And then maybe you will be more informed than Kelly and I are if you've read the book or listened to the book by the time the next episode comes on. But Nicole Hammer, author of Partisans, will be back for the second installment of Partisans Week in a couple days. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.